past 3 years, we've been fed a story about the Russia-Ukraine conflict, one shaped by media spin, political agendas, and global power plays. But how much of this is the truth? How much of what we think we know is actually manipulation? Today, we break through the noise in this special edition of Unfazed Under Fire, and I'm very excited to bring on a person who is uniquely positioned to cut through the misinformation, my co-host, Anatoly Yakorev. Many of you may not be aware that Anatoly was born and raised in Russia. He was trained in psychological operations and was a first-hand witness to the fall of the Soviet Union and the rise of Vladimir Putin. Anatoly has also served as a bridge between Eastern and Western business cultures, having spent decades helping American companies navigate the Russian market. Finally, with family still in Ukraine, he carries a perspective that both is deeply informed and profoundly personal. Now, this conversation couldn't be more timely as peace negotiations are shifting the global landscape. We're diving deep in, beyond the headlines, into the hidden forces driving this war, the geopolitical realities reshaping power, and the business opportunities emerging as U.S.-Russia relations thaw. We'll also examine how psychological warfare has been used, not just abroad, but right here in the U.S., to shape public opinion. This isn't just another discussion. It's an invitation to an important perspective shift. Anatoly, I'm thrilled to have you for this special edition of Unfazed Under Fire. Thanks for being here. We're looking forward to this conversation.
Yes, thank you, David. I'm very happy to be on your podcast because what you're doing is incredibly important, okay? Providing an angle on the role of leadership and how this could be viewed within the context of our complex reality. And so I'm very happy to be on your program. And
Thanks again.
Just because you provide the focus on leadership and help business people understand how we can make sense of this. So I will try to also control my tangents and provide just enough information within the bounds of your focus, because I don't want to inundate people with the relevant information. So just to share only basic relevant points, just to help build that narrative for us to go forward. So, okay. So
yeah, what I want to do is let's frame the show a little bit. Let me share what we're going to share so that people understand what we're going to be covering in the podcast. And we're going to be covering 6 critical areas. You'll be providing a unique perspective, as we said, your understanding of the Russian and Ukrainian history, culture, and politics, and why it matters more than ever. Second, we'll explore the psychology of influence and brainwashing, specifically how psyop strategies are used to shape public opinion and how political and media narratives are used to engage these tactics, including in the U.S., and we'll touch on the U.S. application of those things. We'll look beyond the Russian-Ukrainian headlines and explore the heart of the conflict through the eyes of somebody, you, who understands both sides. We'll also examine Trump's leadership role in creating global stability by exploring your take on Trump's leadership, how it's influencing peace efforts and reshaping global dynamics. We'll touch on the thawing relations between U.S. and Russia, and we know that this week was just announced that a major economic partnership is forming between the two countries that could really provide opportunities for American businesses. And we're going to touch on your insights on what American businesses can be thinking about to navigate that evolving landscape. And finally, we'll touch on the role of conscious leadership in global transformation, as I said, how elevating leadership consciousness can lead to greater peace, prosperity, and a more unified world. So that's a good number of things to cover. It's a very robust show. So let's dive in. And what I'd like you to share first is give us a little flavor of your life growing up in Russia and how it shaped some of you've been around and some of the most pivotal moments in Russian history and seeing them firsthand with a front row seat. So can you walk us through your early years in the Soviet Union, your time in the military, and how you came to work in psyops, and what it was like when the Soviet Union fell, and how these experiences kind of shaped your worldview?
Okay, well, let's dive in then. I think my life experience can provide some context for what we're witnessing today. So back in the Soviet days, it's more like mid-80s, when I was being trained to become a liaison community officer for Afghanistan with some background in psyops. I actually gradually began to explore what that war meant as I was learning more about, heinous crimes. And, they're normally covered up by any government in the world these days. But it made a huge impact on me then. because I conducted my own investigation into this and was horrified as I was grasping with that reality. And it really shaped my late, teen years and then later years growing up. But growing up, it was important to know that my dad was in the Air Force, and I was practically raised by the Special Forces unit, so-called Spetsnaz, like, you probably heard it from the American flicks, and which is a rough comparison to maybe, the US Ranger Regiment or the British, SAS, Special Air Service. And I was used as a ragtag toy by those guys to they really tried to teach me, some hard knocks of life and to toughen me up. And that helped me later a great deal when I became a cadet at the military academy. So combining martial arts and mental toughness really helped me for sure. But even when I was a cadet, I want to point out a few interesting elements because we were learning a lot, not just from the Soviet propaganda, Kool-Aid, but we were learning a lot from American manuals on PSYOPs, just like Field Manual 33 and 1 on psychological operations that was used by the US Army in the 70s. Just basically covered the principles and how the planning stages and execution of PSYOP campaigns were meant to be conducted, including the use of propaganda, leaflets, radio broadcast, and all kinds of media, including spreading rumors to influence enemy forces and civilian populations. So think about it, the Soviets used American brainwashing techniques, just like some MK Ultra stuff, to promote a grander cause. So, but I have to tell you that the Soviet Union did have some soft power as well. Because, when you start talking about free health, access to that, free housing, no joblessness, it must have really helped shape a bit of a more humane touch for conditions of people in the Western population as well, because of that fierce competition those days. So, well, after about a decade, it was a decade of war in Afghanistan, the troops were pulled out just right before my graduation in 90. And I was sort of freed to go from there. And to help matters further, the Soviet Union decided to collapse in 1991. And I was really set free by those events to do something else with my life. So, but that part of my life heavily was influenced by my perspective on war and peace, because later on I learned more about the plight of Afghan people and the crimes committed later, even by the US, British, and Australian troops, despicable crimes in nature for which no one went to jail. So, but Trump's call for peace among the warmongering in Europe and what's going on and all this insanity resonated deeply with me. And I just want to point out a few things that I did just recently with my colleagues at the Conscious Enterprises Network to counter that ongoing incessant warmongering. We launched an initiative called the Peace Charter. And just 2 weeks ago, we had this official launch just to really give business a chance to say something on those matters. Because usually, businesses are never consulted about, how they're impacted by the ongoing hostilities. And a decade ago, when I founded the World Without Corruption initiative, basically I had the same idea in mind. That businesses, they need to be given a chance to say something on matters of corruption and, of course, on matters of war and peace.
Very good. Oh, that's quite a set of experiences you've had. And you also saw Russia evolve from the Soviet era to now modern day Putin's Russia. So how has his rise of power reshaped the Russian psyche and national identity? And what are your thoughts about his leadership?
Well, this is an interesting comparison because if you look at Putin versus Trump, it's like a spook versus a businessman, right? They really don't have much in common. However, one thing that you may look and admire is that the rise of that strong authority when, people kind of really have a bit of a strong leader. And we've never really had any strong leaders since the end of the World War II, really. I mean, why does it have to be a war to bring forth, bigger leaders, which is really strange, But this is what we are dealing with. And yes, before we go into Putin, it's interesting that when I spent some time working with my Democrat friends, and I observed certain things that kind of made me wonder where their mindset came from. Because when I asked them if they were patriots of their own country, they kind of looked at me like, oh, you're an idiot. Who wants to talk about it? And then when I saw that during the anthem, I mean, the US anthem, they never really paid any attention. They were busy with their phones, and some of them even remained seated. So I began to think, like, well, this is interesting. Why would someone, dislike their country so much? Well, at the same time, don't mind pillaging it, because I looked at Russia and we had the same situation. So the Russian, population, well, less so, but it was equally split between so-called liberals, right, that were using a lot of bad mouthing and stuff like that. At the same time, some of them were funded by the USAID, which now, know what happened to it.
It's defunct.
And at the same time, those oligarchs who were, pillaging Russia and parking their riches outside in the West. So if you look at all of that, it just creates a pretty crazy show. And I was just wondering that maybe the role of a personality and a true leader is more important for humanity than having dilapidated and corrupt institutions combined with a lot of incessant, brainwashing and conditioning that comes with it. So what do we choose? Do we deal with deeply seated public institutions that pursue their own role? And like Trump just said, those bureaucrats, they're self-serving. Well, it's not different from Russia, because any bureaucracy.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's very similar, I'm sure, to the
Absolutely.
institutions there, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The moment they feel they have become institutionalized, then they promote their own agenda. They don't care whoever gets elected. So that's why, in my first and the only trip to Washington, D.C., when I met, leaders of not leaders, but representatives of the deep state, people get born into those roles and they retire from those roles regardless of who runs the country. And that just reminded me of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union bureaucracy was exactly that way. You just have to pledge your alliance only once just to become a communist, and they're taken care of for life. So now think about who benefits from that. It's definitely U.S. taxpayer dollars, that go into deep pockets and some very crazy projects, that they pursue. It's the same everywhere, be that Russia, be that the US, be that Europe. And of course, the bureaucracy will fight back. They will fight tooth and nail. So yes, there's a difference. Because when I look at Trump, I think I can admire the guy because he's been through a lot, beaten up by the press like no one. I mean, Putin has never gone through that, right? So he was kind of spared that. And that's why he had a lot of time on his hands to carefully craft, his own empire and have so many people working for him to do that. If you look around for other examples, even Iran, they don't have that much ideology, right? They just have the religion, but, they developed in a very similar fashion. So, I understand that, that even though nobody talks about it, but the Dems were in love with Putin for a long time because they were getting a lot of perks from that relationship. And they were using the same playbook that they were using for, regarding race, migration, and stuff like that, and the way they would deal with the, general population, and, but these days, what Trump brought forth is the ability to suddenly see that double standards remain double standards regardless what country you apply them to. Now, just to give an example, when the International Criminal Court decided that Putin is a military criminal, and then Netanyahu, joined the list. Suddenly, Germany's new chancellor said, like, oh, no, Netanyahu can come over to Germany. It doesn't matter what the criminal court says. And Poland did the same. But if Putin goes anywhere, we'll arrest him. And those double standards are just glaring. Yeah. Okay? And no one raises his bushy eyebrow over that.
Well, anything that's all important. I don't think Americans realize, and I love the comparison to the Soviet Union and the clear corruption that goes on in those institutions for lifelong institutional players. And I think America is just beginning to wake up because of Doge and other things that are happening. Regardless of if you think about that, things are being revealed in a certain way people don't want to look at, but that we're seeing is that we've had the same, maybe more shiny corruption that's been covered up, and that has been not in the purview of Americans. So I appreciate you saying that. But as you move to, just to go back just real quickly, when Putin came into power, how has he changed Russia? What is his leadership style? And how do you view that? And how has he changed Russia?
Well, let's put it this way. So basically what he normally talks about, that he kind of stopped the lawlessness and all that, during the breakup of the Soviet Union for an entire decade, we had a lot of lawlessness, and when oligarchs came to power, And so basically, he's just saying that he brained a lot of like law and order. Well, as you understand that, in a truly democratic country, you have all sorts of checks and balances. And normally you talk about like, independent judiciary, free press and all that. Well, you can't really have all of that in a country when it's run in some authoritarian fashion. Okay. Because this is something that we will also see whether that will happen with Trump in due course, right? Because the entire press in the US is all Democrat, right? So liberal and stuff like that. Now, in Russia these days, since Putin did away with the liberal press, and this is like tightly controlled, and you just don't really get much dissent, which is really gets stamped out. But now, do we really see what's the right way in the middle? On one hand, you do have the institutions that work. On the other hand, you don't have much, free press. But at the same time, nobody really complains about other authoritarian countries like Singapore. Singapore is equally authoritarian, right? But it's praised. And, just because, well, yeah, they have really tough laws. If you spit on the pavement, get 500 US dollars, if not more, and stuff like that. So it's governed like with the, iron hand. Now, Putin is doing something similar with a much larger country. Now, the way, the Russia is governed doesn't really contribute much to the population in terms of like, how the economy is doing and whether the really free market forces are being used. Well, with all the stuff that's going on right now, definitely you don't see much of that. But the idea is at some point, it's going to stop being a gravy train for anybody. So whoever just realizes that, well, because we all split up over like, okay, justice over economy. Okay. So when a lot of people really want to have to see justice done at the same time, everybody's hurting from what's going on. And what really is interesting, Trump saw that opportunity to use the economy and hold people accountable in the process. And he makes it very clear. Let's step out of this ideological divide, who is doing what and how. Because we all know a lot of people got away with crimes and a lot of big names. Okay. So
Yes.
just like I gave you an example, Netanyahu versus Putin, right? It's the same thing. So Putin did deliver, his own version of capitalism, as it was called, and is still called like crony capitalism. But like in lots of countries, people give and share their power with their friends, right? I mean, okay, what do you do? What can you do about that? Can you still work with them? Same thing with that example I provided with Singapore. Yes, it was a bit different. Well, Lee Kuan Yew put his friends behind, bars and things changed. But once he died, well, who was doing what? It's not really clear. So we're looking now at the situation whether, leaders can be judged by their actions and what those actions will actually provide. I think it's much better just to go beyond the words because it's been 3 years of ongoing bloodshed and carnage, and that needs to stop because nobody can go any further because that has become a war of attrition by definition. So that's what we're dealing with. And whoever can put a stop to that will be viewed as a true leader.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to get to that more in a moment about the terrible conflict and what's your view on that. But I wanted to step into this, and we touched on that in some of your opening comments about your experience in Russia and the changes that happened that you saw. You served in PSYOPs, right? Where you saw firsthand how mass influence and brainwashing strategies work. And you touched on that a little bit earlier. How are these tactics deployed in an attempt to shape the psyche of an entire population? What are the mechanisms that we can be aware of in our own media landscape and political landscape to see these things so that we can have those distinctions?
Well, I wouldn't say I served in PSYOPs because technically I was a cadet, and then when I graduated, I quit the army, and then the Soviet Union fell apart.
So you were early on in your career.
Yeah, but I learned a lot about how that stuff is done. And this is where, you really begin to see the pattern. And the pattern is very universal. How propaganda works, it just goes back to the Nazi propaganda, right? So why it was so successful? Well, same principles that they had then are applied these days, right? So it's the idea of the whole centralized control, that all of the stuff that's being distributed runs through one specific filtering system, and that provides the uniformity of the media, right? And one thing that probably will resonate with us more is that back in the mid 30s in Nazi Germany, they really focused on the technological innovation, adoption of the radio, distribution of the radios, film, using any visual media they could to promote the narrative. And we know, like we see that, well, more so with the US than with Russia, like with the big tech, right? That decidedly play a role in distributing the propaganda. Now, some principles that are very, very simple. Speaking of simplicity, you grab complex ideas and you reduce them to some very, very simple but emotionally charged and resonant messages. Okay. And then you use that repeatedly. You recreate and you redundantly use the same theme over and over again, but you do it across multiple channels to disguise the fact that it's the same theme. And then, like really exploiting existing, prejudices, be that racial or anything else, it's definitely that's usually they kind of put it on, the right leaning outlets, but it's the same. If you look across the board, the creation of enemies, adversaries, specific words for them, and how it's done in a way that you very quickly go from calling someone an extremist to terrorist and to Nazi and all that. So throwing those words around and nobody's held accountable, that creates this idea of lawlessness that people can get away with it because nobody's used them, right? And it just opens this whole can of worms. And then what's really sometimes is important to understand that there's a lot of kind of pseudo-scientific backing and you using a lot of various crazy ideas to camouflage the information that is being disseminated, and even though like you combine that also with certain events to kind of disguise it even further, like Olympics, certain things that would be like making a splashing on main news, but certain ideas that they sometimes use is very effective. What is the most effective thing? Is creating fear, right? But mixing fear and hope creates a very strange perception and really confuses people, because you throw in like one thread, but then you kind of coat it with something else and you play it down, and you use that a lot to actually keep people totally confused. Now, also at the same time, I was wondering that how many shrinks actually, participated in creating that very complex level of propaganda and brainwashing, because sometimes you cannot help but notice certain, psychological manipulation techniques that normally are used, only for the betterment of a human species. But you see that, sometimes getting weaponized. And that actually makes me worry because people get away with it, right? And nobody will be held accountable for that, even though the use of propaganda against their own population, I think, has been dubbed as a crime sometime earlier. But it still remains to be seen how we deal with the aftermath of that.
Well, so what I'm hearing is that there's an interrelationship between political forces, media sources, and technology like big tech. The question is that at some level, somebody's driving all that. So in those is the political forces, I would take, are deriving that and are forming these relationships because of a shared ideology. I'm not sure. Probably the ideology is even created for the ultimate goal that those people have. It's going to support them in reaching the goal, which is more control. This which I hear is a central theme. Where is if you look at the U.S. right now and look at what we've dealt with, we're now coming out that a lot of lies were told during COVID, for example. So many lies. And to your point, all scientific information was used to reinforce this is the right message. And you can't take vitamin D because that's pie in the sky. You have to stay with the vaccine. But forget that. That's misinformation. Cancel that. Take that off Facebook. But what is the central force that is driving this? And how do they develop those relationships such that they're in sync? Even to the point where you can watch news broadcasts on a particular day and go across the country to different cities and see newscasters saying identical content in sync that is reinforcing it across different cities.
Well, okay, so yeah, I cannot really go deep into identifying who's behind, who's doing this, and how it's all, how it all came together. because that could be viewed as like being
That
insensitive.
would,
But I know where it's
yeah.
coming from, and we have the same problem in Russia, and there is the same problem, elsewhere. But it's interesting. Like, let's just focus on the fact that it has been converted into the real art of propaganda, right? I mean, it's like really, it's amazing. Like these days, we have people who are completely brainwashed. I mean, like the people I know, both in Russia, outside of Russia, like you can't really go into anything because it triggers the Trump derangement syndrome, right? They just fly off the handle. I mean, you just cannot help it. So technically speaking, the probably the biggest name who looked and dissected the origin and the roots of that propaganda is Noam Chomsky in the United States, who was specifically looking at why is that the so-called democratic propaganda has evolved to be that way. Because compare that to the Russian authoritarian propaganda, which is very direct and very obvious, right? It lacks the complexity being used by so-called free press because it actually uses a very complex system to push forth the narrative. And why is it so complex? Because it takes two different things. It takes the economic incentive to create that propaganda because it's all based on managing advertising revenues, and it's not really about subscriptions, just basically creating some appropriate consumption environment and stories that might depress, disturb, and alienate consumers. They would not really like that because they're not commercially desirable. But creating this complex mechanisms so that you convert that into the stream of money and at the same time create the symbiotic relationship where the media works directly with officials and supports their narrative, right? And also ease up on professional constraints. Because let's look around these days. Well, journalism is dead. Anywhere you
yes.
go, you see propaganda, people under the guise of journalism promoting specific narratives. So, well, let's call a spade a spade. Okay, they're not journalists, right? Because they already breached the
Entertainers.
boundaries of what's acceptable and what's what not. And even if you look at the career incentives, it's all about how much you can really rile the populace, so to speak. And that just creates a totally different incentive. All the pools of experts and reasoning is gone. And the idea is all about like how you create emotionally charged news. But this is the problem because people can only stay in that emotionally disturbed
I
state
agree.
for this long because then your psyche kind of gives up and you can no longer handle it unless you have reached a stage when you have become so brainwashed so then there's no going back. You get totally hijacked by this narrative. You can only consume by default that type of media that sustains you in that state. So that's a brilliant way of managing this type of propaganda, according to, again, to Noam Chomsky, because when he states that, the appearance of this free press, it just maintains this appearance because it achieves the same outcome as the direct censorship in the authoritarian country, So those people who consider themselves to be journalists, they don't feel constrained, right? They think like they're doing the right thing because the critical thinking is switched off and they fully are immersed in what they're doing is the only thing to present the information. So now when the money trickling, kind of like stops, it creates a new competitive environment for people who can really truly do the journalism work and they could take over from the propaganda people. Now they would not be even journalists. So maybe this will create a new generation of the real free press. Well, remains to be
Well, I
seen.
think that's emerging. If you look at like Ben Greenwald or Schellenberger or Taimi, or there is a growing alternative. They not called alternative. I think it's becoming the main source for a lot of people. That these are people that think, they ground it, they're critical thinking, they push against sometimes their own narratives when they find out that the facts don't. So these are real. This is still real journalism is alive. It's just not in the and that's not in the boob tube, so to speak. And we've seen this like ideological, we don't want to touch on the deep ideological divisions that this has created in the U.S. As you pointed to, you can't speak to somebody. Like, what I'm hearing you say is the psychic is so overwhelmed at a certain point, it just accepts the message. And it doesn't, we become lazy. When you're brainwashed, you become lazy to, even if you're delivered a video that shows factually you're incorrect, you won't even watch it because your psyche says, done, time out. We're not doing this anymore. This is what I believe. And now I'm just going to argue this point. And if you start throwing facts at me, my last recourse is just to call you names. That's the last recourse. And you know, when somebody's brainwashed, and you're like, you show them something factual, they say, you're an idiot. That's why I'm having the conversation. I'm seeing, this woke agenda that's been utilized in the United States. It's very similar to the propaganda that you're speaking of. And in a certain way, what I'm sensing from this is a real short answer on this one. The powers to be don't even care about the philosophy. What's behind the philosophy? Do they really care about transgender people? Do they really care about the plight of Ukrainians? The messages they do. But that seems like the method is not, they're up to something else. They're wanting something else. Is that fair to say?
Well, it's actually very simple. It's all about money, right? Because if you look at like all these projects that are being reviewed that the USAID, sponsored, technically there's a very tiny piece of it gets to the targeted, or target audience, right? So basically, it's all about how much money stays in the pockets of the ones who manage the money flow.
There you go.
Nobody really cares, about like, for example, let's look at the situation with Ukraine. Okay, they keep pouring a lot of money in. At the same time, they say it remains a very corrupt country. Okay, so my question is like, if you put in so much money and then you say it remains corrupt, so what you gonna do about it? Do you see, again, it's a whole thing. They don't want to stop the money, they don't want to do the audit, they don't want to check the books, but nobody's doing that. It just creates this whole, narrative. It's like very few benefit, and at the same time, the gravy train still stays there. And that's what the problem is, because nobody is actually calling it out for what it is.
Yeah. Well, I want to transition to talk a little bit about the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And I know that you left Moscow almost 2 years ago because to not serve in a quote unquote military operation, given, first of all, you have family in Ukraine that are Russian nationals, and you didn't want to go into, you saw the nature of what the conflict was, and you didn't want to go fight your family. What is your personal opinion about how this evolved, this conflict evolved, and what is at the heart of it? And that maybe Americans don't fully appreciate because of your understanding of the relationship between these two countries and the reasoning for this happening.
Oh, well, that's a tough one because you see, technically speaking, anything I say, there's so much divisiveness around this topic. So I can only say it from my very, very small perspective. Okay. So, let's put it this way. I'm the only Russian passport holder in my family. Okay, so basically everybody in my family is a Ukrainian citizen. So, but currently my mom is a refugee in Ireland. My other family members are spread, between Poland and Portugal, with half of my family remaining in Ukraine. Okay, so I'm kind of stuck between the two countries. So it's like in Russia they hate me for having my immediate family in Ukraine. In Ukraine they hate me for being a Russian passport holder. So it's a catch-22. When I went to bury my father in 2020, they didn't want to let me cross the border. I mean, the Ukrainians said, like, well, there's got to be somebody else to bury your father. Go back. And I was not the only one. There were lots of people in the same position. So I'm just saying, okay, let's look at the nature of this whole situation. I don't want to go much into history and all that. I'll just give you one simple fact. Ukrainians are very different from Russians, and they're much tougher. They're more commercially driven. And, as we used to say a lot that in Russia, they would compete with any Jew, because they're so savvy when it comes to doing things. So it's not a surprise that a majority of Ukrainians did very well in Putin's Russia. If you look at the names in the Forbes list, of people who are billionaires, you will only see one Russian name. Potanin. The rest of them is like, other people, they're not really ethnic Russians. Same thing. If you look at the army, you look at the special forces, you look at the intelligence agencies, all you see ethnic Ukrainian names. Why is that? is because ever since Bolsheviks came to power, they embarked on the ethnic cleansing of ethnic Russians. There were too many Russians. It's kind of difficult, to run them. So basically, by hook or by crook, they really reduced the population of ethnic Russians quite a bit. And they never really allowed them to make any careers. And then over time, just like some Darwinistic experiment, Russians did become a bit lazy, non-competitive, so on and so forth. Okay, so this is just one fact. If you look at it from this perspective, you think, oh, when the war broke out, how could it be? Well, this is the thing, because, if you really switch on the critical thinking and you look at the people who are leading technically all the military operations and all of that stuff that was going on, it was so crazy and so surreal that the cognitive dissonance would just kick in because it doesn't make any sense. Okay.
So you have military leaders on the Russian side that have deep Ukrainian roots that are orchestrating this war against Ukraine on the Russian side.
Well, this has always been historically the case. They did so much better than ethnic Russians. You won't see much of common ethnic Russian names like Petrov, Ivanov, right? And like I said, same thing applies to commerce, and across the board. But for anybody outside of Russia, they see this. It's Russians doing this. Russophobia that kicked in as a result. Then the Baltic states started really, kicking out ethnic Russians for not being able to speak the language. Wow, even if you're 80 years old, you get kicked out of the country. So, there's so much of misconception and just lies, so that people, when they look at this, they think whatever they get from the news, that must be the only truth. But reality is totally different. And I'm not going deep into this and any other differences.
I understand there's a lot. No, this is a very complex situation, and we have to honor the time we have. It is also interesting narrative we're being told. Which is, of course, I feel for the Ukrainian. And I want to touch on how your family's doing and what their experience has been, which I can't imagine it's been anything but horrendous. But that the idea that we're here to help the Ukrainian people and pouring this money in when that wasn't, I don't believe, was the ultimate agenda. And on the other side of the field, the people that are fighting on the side that we're against are fundamentally led by Ukrainian military leaders. It's sad, really sad, and very tough to hear. How has your family dealt with this situation in Ukraine that you've been in communication with them? And I can't imagine how difficult it's been, but what are they dealing with on the other side in this war?
Well, that's interesting because, my parents, they voted for Zelensky during the presidential elections because, again, speaking of the propaganda, he actually conducted a very elaborate campaign to win over the hearts and minds of Ukrainian people. Because, being a comedian, but then because of his TV, show and the Servant of the People that was launched in 2015, a lot of people really placed their trust in him. So my parents also voted for him. Well, it was a bit different from for the rest of the family. They had different opinions and stuff like that. And of course, being Ukrainian citizens, they reeled from shock when the invasion started. And it's absolutely understandable. And I don't want to really go much into this because there's so much of it, whether Putin didn't want NATO to get closer to the borders and stuff like that, who did what and why. It's the whole information, the whole truth is buried under very thick layers. But let's focus on just the emotional side of it, right? It was just a horrible experience and the kind of a shock and terror that very few people could really understand unless you really end up in that situation, because most people deal with the news and deal with the fact that this is going on, and they really supported a lot of Ukrainians outside of Ukraine who left. It doesn't matter if people were fleeing for their lives, including the Ukrainian males who didn't want to really die in the trenches. Okay, so we are dealing with a lot of ethical and issues of morality. So it's a tough one. It's a tough one to really look at because it's all about is it about your survival I mean, you, or is it like you got to be like a volunteer, go and die, or you got to be drafted, or like what they use right now, a situation when people are in no hurry to go and allow themselves to be drafted, and they even created a term in Ukraine called busification from the word bus, when they were using the vans to actually hunt down people on the streets and draft them using the brutal force.
Well, I
So it
saw
is going to
videos
a
of them
point.
going into educational centers where these young people were and
Well,
pulling
it's
them
not
out
even.
of
Yes,
educational
that's
centers.
right.
Yeah.
Yes. So
Yeah. I mean,
so that's why a lot of people are
they were
hiding.
not, they weren't taken because they volunteered.
No, no.
Yeah.
Well, because you see, it's been 3 years, and the war of attrition kicks in. Because people just realize that okay, we cannot reclaim the territory. So shall we continue sacrificing our young, or maybe not so young, people, let them all die? So it's gonna what continue. I mean, you see what I'm saying? It's like it's a catch-22. It's a dead end. So what Trump has done is like, okay, guys, you seem to be unable to finish this war. So I can step in and give you a chance. Okay. I mean, like, look, I mean, let's put it this way. I mean, I read the Ukrainian press, and basically they keep mudslinging and bad mouthing Trump. Okay. And today I saw a very small headline in the Ukrainian Pravda, when they say, oh, the National Endowment for Democracy is cutting money to us as a media outlet so we can no longer badmouth Trump because that money is not coming through. I mean, they don't even realize how crazy it sounds. You
It sounds,
openly say that you
that's
get
just
that
nuts.
USAID and ANED money, and that was the only reason why you were bad mouthing and like heaping insults on Trump. And it's happening
You
the
get paid
same
for it.
day when
Yeah.
they reached the deal on the rare earth minerals.
Right.
You see how crazy that is, that people cannot even see what they're doing is like totally deranged. So, by the way,
Well, and yeah.
just what I
Yeah.
want to mention one more thing about the Baltic states, because this is
Sure.
another thing I saw in the Ukrainian press when the former head of the Lithuanian Foreign Affairs, Landsbergis, was saying, don't listen to Trump, keep on fighting. Okay, this is interesting. You see, he's like saying, like, okay, well, whatever Trump has to offer, you don't have to take it. Just keep on fighting. We are with you. Well, at the same time, it's really crazy. This whole warmongering coming from small Baltic states, right? To tell people go and die and don't pin your hopes to Trump. You see, it's like it's again. I'm just using from today's editions of the Ukrainian press. So this needs to stop, and Trump is doing the best he can.
Well, for some in the U.S., if you look at Zelensky, he's a heroic figure for us. I mean, and he is propped up in the press as this great leader who's, and of course, leading his country to duress. I'm just curious what your view of his leadership is, and if you had said your family voted for him, if there's been any shift in views in your perspective of the Ukrainian people towards him, from your perspective of what you hear.
Yeah, well, like, look, my family, just like anybody else, right? They really want this bloodshed to stop. I mean, technically speaking, let's put it this way. Is there a chance to win this war with Russia? Well, it's a much bigger country with more resources, right? And sanctions have not really crippled Russia. So let's, again, remember what Trump said. It's time for common sense. So let's apply common sense here. Okay. I mean, dealing with grief and understanding, processing all those heinous crimes and casualties is a different story, right? But you can't really break it up and like focus on this and not do something else. So whoever does something right now, this will be, I think, welcomed, even if people are not ready for this way of stopping the war.
But you said that the bloodshed has to stop. It's terrible what's been going on there, and there's what's the return been? There has been zero return on this. You've been speaking about Donald Trump throughout this with some positive flavor to it. So as you look at him as a leader and look at his first 30 days in office, how do you view him? And this is coming from a perspective, you're not in the American culture, you're not in these battles between this separation we're dealing with. You're coming from a perspective from being a Russian, watching him operate. What is your impressions of his first 30 days in office and who he is as a leader?
Well, probably his actions speak much better than his words, right? Because he's using a very unique combination of trolling the public and the media for the most part. He's actually, yeah, it's quite amazing. By the way, it kind of reminds me of Putin because Putin used, a bit of a crude humor back in the days. Okay, but it's totally different style. So him trolling the news and even European leaders, like with this thing about Greenland and making Canada the 51st state and stuff like
Canada,
that.
fifth
Okay,
year.
it's just a way of trolling the public, but at the same time, you look at the actions. Like he swiftly dispatched the troops to the border. He talked to the Mexican president. He really like put everybody in gear to do what he says. Now, isn't that amazing? Imagine for a second that you outsource decision making to the existing institutions. It would have taken years, right? But what he did is like, okay, I want this done, and this done. In a matter of days, things happen. That's like magic. When you were talking about Putin, well, you don't see Putin. He's never done anything like it. So that's what I'm just saying. Look at Trump, and you see he overrides this entrenched opposition, and nobody ever thought that he would be able to do that, right? They're kind of like, oh yeah, he's just trolling. Yeah, he was trolling, but when everybody was distracted, he swiftly moved in, signed some, executive orders, and things were done. Now, my question to you, have you ever seen historically anything like I cannot remember even a single example of such a style.
Well, you have to look at results. And that's what I look at from a leadership perspective. He has a style, drives people crazy. And he uses that, knowing that he drives people crazy, as you say, to troll them. So he does other, he moves on and does other things. But we have a border that had 10,000 people coming in a day. It's now down to 400. We secured the border. We are building a strategy to go right after the cartels, and they're in deep doo-doo. I mean, you can, they're in deep doo-doo because we're just laser focus on them. We have, waste and fraud and abuse, however you say he's done this, has been revealed. And I think he's pulling the covers off slowly of the deep state. Of course, the way he's perceived and the large part of the population still believes he's doing all this to be more Putin-like, And that's an interesting distinction for you to say. Putin is who Putin is Trump anything like him other than he has some similar stylistic things? What would you say to that? What is the difference between Putin and Trump?
Yeah, well, the difference is this. It's very simple.
Yeah.
Hey, very simple. His team, when they say like the retinue or the entourage makes the king, right? His team is very articulate. Yeah, it's just it's a pleasure to watch them talk. Okay, yes. So every one of them. So definitely, it's on the merit based. Principle that you get these people to join his vision. Now, you don't see that in the authoritarian style much, right? Because it's not in the merit-based. It's on the loyalty-based, okay? So that's why it's two distinctly different approaches. So that's why, his team helps him shine. I mean, Trump's team helps him shine, okay? So it's not like he dominates and he shows, like in authoritarian countries, you have their leaders who spend hours on television. I mean, like Chavez.
Yes.
Chavez was talking for 7 hours, just crazy. So that's, I think, there's a very distinct difference. It's the team effort.
But it's also the team is being driven from the vision and the agenda, not from his point of view. He says, here's the results I want to generate. Here's the vision for our country. We're going back to America first. We're going back to we, the people. We're going back to the constitutional basis of taking care of the American people. That's your job. And he's got people in his team who are fully aligned to that. I would say that our servants, they're not there for their own, but they may be there for their own. Everybody's looking to grow their persona and identity in the world. There's nothing wrong with that. They're truly there with a genuine sense of service and a sense of deep connection to the vision. So that's leadership at a high level to me. So, I mean, again, people are going to maybe hear this and turn it off because I said that, but it's so true. I mean, I compare that with the last administration where we were basically rudderless. Literally, we didn't realize we were really rudderless, where unelected officials were running the government. They talked about Elon, but they were talking, you actually had actual people in the Biden administration were not the president, that we're acting as the president, and that's come out. But anyway, I appreciate your comments on that. And, anything else you wanted to add to that?
Well, I think we are living like in a very pivotal, historical moment, and there's no other leader on the face of this planet that's captivating the attention of the people. Well, let's face it, right? I mean, look at European leaders. It's a gaggle of people. They have their chops, they have their techniques and all that, but they cannot catalyze so many people, and especially when the actions back up the words, right? So that's why I just want to really point out to that this is a true example of leadership. Okay, so and that's why, because you are focused, you focus on promoting leadership, right? And that's actually
Yes,
now my
it's
question
leadership.
for
There's no doubt
you:
about it.
what can we learn from his leadership and his style? Is there a lesson for business leaders?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, he speaks to the hearts of the people. And I don't think people get and understand, because they have this, again, their psyches are exhausted, and they believe narcissist or dictator. That's what he is, because that's where I go. But you look at his rallies and everything, he speaks to people's concerns. He speaks to their pain, and he says, I'm going to solve it. So he has a vision for America. So he has a vision, which is not crazy. And I mean, you had Hakeem Jeffries get on who's the Democratic leader in Congress, get up and say, we've never seen any danger to our country like since the Civil War. And I'm going, but what are you talking about? And then, of course, I think the concerns there are different. We will go into that. But the idea is that he is speaking to the hearts of what we all care about. He's bringing us back home to our roots. So that's number one. Number two, he's built a great team. I don't care what you say. Tulsi Gabbard, Pam Bodie, say what you will about Kash Patel. These are all, as you say, articulate servant leaders that are super smart and super competent. And he has orchestrated this by delivering the message. You're the Defense Department. All we want is a top-rate warrior culture where they care deeply about our country, and they're there. And what we've also noticed is, since Trump has been in office, enlistments in the military have skyrocketed. They're making up for lost time. They couldn't get anybody to enroll in the military during Biden administration. They were really having a hard time. That has totally changed. So it's ignited something in all of us to some different degrees. So I see that, and ultimately he's delivering on his promises. So say what you will about his integrity, but there's nobody, I've never seen in both his terms, anybody in such a short period of time. What politician does that? And so he then galvanizes trust more and those that voted for him, because you're doing what you said you do. So, I mean, that's what I would say.
Let me just make one point here. What you're describing is very important, because leaders are judged by how closely they reflect the reality. And he is not detached from the reality. Because look at other leaders. They create their own bubble, and they live in that reality they create because they're comfortable with it. And I find it incredibly compelling that, in Trump's case, he is so connected with the reality that's going on the ground. Because, you look at other leaders, they live in their own realm. They create their media reality, It's about time to really sing praise to me. So let's spend a week so that the media can sing praise, and glorify my name. I mean, yeah, you see that. It's crazy, pathetic. So that's why, I don't know how he manages to stay in touch with what's going on the ground. I hope one day books will be written on this topic, but I think that would be really groundbreaking to know that.
Well, good. I appreciate this conversation. I want to transition into another territory, which is juxtaposition of war. Maybe a little challenging out of this conversation, but it's an important one, I think. And that is the emerging opportunities as the Russian-Ukrainian, at least Russian-American relations thaw. Now, you have worked extensively with Western corporations. Share a little bit of how you've helped American businesses bridge that cultural divide. And we're going to talk a little bit about the opportunities that you might see happening and unfolding in Russia for American business. But I'm curious, what is your background in helping build that bridge of that cultural divide and for businesses and turning your business in Russia?
Yeah, well, remember when I was talking about when I quit the army, I was quickly picked up by Amoco and in 1991, and basically was that was my first encounter with American engineers and people who were coming over to see, if there are any opportunities, kind of like, do a bit of a reconnaissance. And then I realized that Russians and Americans have a lot more in common than with Europeans because people are more practical. Okay. They ask very specific questions. There's no, overriding like our culture beats your culture, right? So I was pleasantly surprised by that. But then at the same time, unlike, say, Europeans, Americans were more keenly interested in learning what it takes to become successful. If I need to understand how the cookie crumbles here, I want to know it. If you're saying that I need to be culturally sensitive to these things, okay, I'll try to learn that. So there was always more appetite. And I just want to give you one example. When the country manager for Amoco, Zimmerman, was there, so we spent a lot of time, talking about the divide between politics and culture and the post-Soviet mentality and things like that. So he found the time to learn that. So now, like 30 years back, he's a co-founder of the nonprofit that we are running with, like, Collaborative Evolution, focusing on promoting of higher consciousness. Okay. And we always go back to those days, and he told me one thing. But you taught me a good lesson about the importance of building diverse and cross-cultural teams. Because when after Russia, my stint in Russia, I went to work in Latin America, and I was piecing together my competent team in Ecuador. I was very sensitive to that. How do you deploy the cross-cultural knowledge to identify those nuggets, those people with the right skill sets that you really want to have them on your team? Okay. So that was like my experience back then. And then, 25 years that I spent with Amoco, BP, and really helping people learn the culture, the history, politics, language, anything that would help to become competitive and successful. I think now we're getting to a point that this could become, again, an opportunity. Because think about this. With the way this whole thing was going on, with all the international companies pulling out of Russia, okay, with all that divide having been created that European countries have to look elsewhere where to go for investment, suddenly it just opened up an opportunity for American companies to come back in and do business. And there's no competition because European companies were disheartened and dissuaded from doing business with Russia. And of course, Russia, is really looking for a way to recover from the sanctions. Now, you may say, okay, it's a different situation. We have to put politics first. Yeah, but if we put politics first, nobody can benefit from this. So Trump is making it very clear, right? This is your opportunity. Okay, you guys, if you haven't been able to look for peace after 3 years, now when Europe wants to get a seat at the table, but you guys are still promoting the war, okay, you want to promote that? Well, how about you sink your own money in your military budgets? Because right now, I mean, the way I see it, like the US have been sponsoring you for the most part, okay? So how about you start taking care of that? So that's a good example.
Right. Well, and on a practical level, if this thawing is beginning to happen, so I would imagine there are certain business leaders that are taking notice, right? And so if you were, if some practical advice for an American business executive who is thinking about what do they need to consider? Now, some of these may be more or less experienced in doing business in Russia, so this may be elementary to them. Some, what do they need to consider to re-engage in this opportunity that is emerging?
Okay, so first off, basically, I remember when everybody complained, especially in the business circles, how it is difficult to really get any practical solutions and, deal with the bureaucracy. Okay, this is interesting. Now we have a situation when Trump can get Putin to play along with him. Like, keep up with me, Vlad, because if you want to do business and help your business, I am helping my business, right? So you have to sharpen your saw because this is what we can do. And this is now it's becoming a personal competition. Trump is older than Putin, right? And he could say okay, Vlad, chop, chop, chop. If you really want to do something, right, you have to demonstrate that you have the goodwill and you have something, behind to see that we can actually make it work. Okay. So now we see the competition between leaders. Okay. Forget about institutions, forget about councils, organizations, what have you, right? Just focus on personal leadership. And I think business people, they will actually notice that difference. Because I remember back then in the early 2000, you know, only banks, American banks, were saying like, oh no, if case something happens, choppers will come and, save us, right? We're taken care of and the US government is looking after us. There's no such thing, guys, that you were thinking that the US government will save you. The US government never really cared, including the embassy at the time. They were not looking after the business interests ever. And now remember that, okay? There was some sort of a delusion that, look, let's put it this way. I'll just give you a practical example. One country that has been pretty successful in Russia and suffered as a result of all of this is Finland. Because the Finns had a combination of good skills, practicality, they moved in, and they were the only country in Europe that put their diplomatic influence behind their businesses. They would always have, can you imagine the embassy answering the phone when business is called? But now, what did they get? Now they're in NATO, right? Now, because of hostilities, the Finns cannot go back in like they used to. They lost so much, maybe another decade, maybe two. Now, Americans, because, yes, they supplied the weaponry, but they sat across the pond. And Trump can say, look, we lived in the dark because of the Dems, okay? Now
he said he would have never gone. This war would have never happened with him. So he's kind of given him a clean slate to say, I'm a new sheriff in town, and I want to extend my hand to you and say, let's do business and let's put this silliness behind us. Because after all, it's impractical to stay mad at each other and to be suspicious of each other. We have to be careful. We're adversaries, all that. But this is an opportunity, Vlad. This is an opportunity. And so for business leaders, what you're saying is one of the things they will provide if the slate gets somewhat clean and they can step in is by them actually showing up as leaders in a practical way to be of assistance. How can we help so opportunities would exist? And what are opportunities you see in Russia that business leaders could be taking advantage of now, given that framing, either sectors or parts of the country or where they could be assistance? Where there's, because we as businesses, we're looking for where can we solve a pain?
Yeah.
And if we can solve that pain, and the other side believes we can solve that pain, there will be an exchange of capital for that. So where do you see the opportunities in Russia now for American businesses?
Well, it's everywhere across the board. Because imagine this, like I said, because there's any sanctions that usually cripple the economic activity, even though the Russian economy rebounded and demonstrated some resilience that was recognized, right? So, but still, because now it's an opportunity that actually American companies can benefit from from those sanctions. Okay, guys, we create a lot of scarcity here.
That's weird, isn't it?
But think about this. This is like if you're a business person, right? Okay, that scarcity was created for political reasons, right? But we are here to fill in the void, right? We can drown you in goods, and because Russia is a very rich country in mineral, not only minerals, right, but natural resources across the board, right? So technically, you just have to show up and do the business. What I like about this is a human component here. Imagine Trump, appoints a commerce guy,
I'm sure
whoever, just the face of the investment, right? Potential investment. So this guy says, look, there's only one person between you guys, Russians, and me. It's Trump. So you talk to me, right? And Trump will know all of that. Russians will show up, 5,000 people. Okay, 5,000's talking to one person. So this guy would probably say okay, guys, you need to decide among yourselves, okay? Who is the guy who calls the shots so I can talk to him and we'll make it happen. So you see, this style that Trump embodies will invariably reflect it on the Russian side as well, which probably will bring a lot of change. If it doesn't happen through politics, it will happen through the pocket, like you said, the pain, right? So let's use the economy to make it happen then.
So let's get this down to tactics. Obviously, we have to wait for this to play out and see how the relationship's going to form and where those avenues of connection are. If a business leader is kind of woken up and saying, I just didn't realize, or I knew this was the case, but now I'm more interested. What is the first one or two steps an business executive can take to begin to formulate a strategy to move towards opportunities in Russia? What would be the first one or two steps you'd recommend they make?
Yeah. The first step is very simple. Like, you allow this to organically evolve. So you allow business leaders to self-organize. So it's a self-arising force that will basically self-organize and tell Trump, okay, we're ready to invest, right? If you're going to be looking after our interests and create politically viable and economic conditions for us to invest, and you will be watching our backs, we're ready to go in. Okay, it's very simple, right? Of course, anybody who's dealing with that, once you indicate your intention, the only thing that needs to be mirrored by the Russian side, who will say, like, okay, yes, we are ready to create conditions that you guys need for you to come in and do this, right? Because this whole nonsense about dangling the resources, using political games, to cripple businesses and especially investment, these days are gone because we live in a different economic reality now, okay? Plus, globalization kind of fizzled out because now we live in a multipolar world, right? Okay, everybody's aware of China. What do you do? Everybody was saying Russia was in China's pocket. Well, it turns out it's not the case. Then what do we do with Russia? Okay, Europe cannot play with Russia because they are backing up Ukraine in the war. Okay, so maybe it's the U.S. is the only option left.
So this is a huge opportunity for American business. You're seeing it.
Yes, indeed.
And the first step you say is figure out a way to engage the Trump administration, either through the U.S. Department of Commerce or do some liaison directly to begin to have dialogue. Obviously, I would imagine Trump will be knowing him, he'll be creating avenues for that dialogue to happen. So you have to be tuned in to what's happening in the administration and where you can gain access to understand, okay, how do we play this game? What are we going to do? How do we enter? Who do we have to talk to? How do we build alignment in Russia? So being part of those conversations would be a key thing for business leaders right now. And anything else you'd add to that? Any other steps they can? Yeah.
Yeah, I think what's really important, because you remove from the table, those like constant, points of consternation, like politics, historical differences, whatever, all this nonsense, right? That created a lot of noise. You just say, look, okay, even legal side. Okay, guys, we have the intention, right? You just have to clarify your intent. And that will put the legal behind it because the political will is there. And that's something that nobody wants to talk about. Oh, there's no such thing as political will. There's no such thing as a political leader. That has always been the democratic noise, right? Put your trust in our institutions, okay? We are the wise. We know what we're doing. We're mature ideologically. We will help you navigate that complexity. Well, technically, that's how you get everybody to drown, okay? But you remove all that and you say, okay, there's a political will. Everything else is secondary, okay? Everything else is secondary. Legal sides and all of that, because it's very simple. You want to screw this up, you screw it up once, and this opportunity is gone, okay? So do you think that for somebody like Vlad, who will look at this like, okay, it's my only chance to pull myself out of the quagmire, right? And kind of make myself relevant. Do I want to really shoot myself in the foot? Well, I'll have to shape up a bit.
Well, in a certain way, doesn't in my conversations about him before, you've always said this isn't a guy that wants to conquer Europe. He wants to be relevant in Europe. And he wanted to join the European Union. He wanted to be part of Europe. They shunned him. So this is an opportunity for him to kind of recapture some of that for himself, is it not? It's an opportunity for him to be relevant in the world global business environment, for example, and not the greatest human being that there is. That he is, he's not somebody that wants to rule over vast countryside. He wants to be relevant and wants Russia to be relevant. Well, I appreciate that conversation. I think that will help a lot of people spark some ideas within their businesses and their organizations about starting to have this conversation, which is always the first step, and then figuring out how to connect and start taking those steps. So I want to close out the show with we're going to take a right turn here. which goes back to something you were talking about the project you're working at Conscious Enterprise Network, the Peace Initiative. But you've been a long time advocate for, I'll just call it conscious leadership or authentic courageous leadership or servant leadership, however you frame it, leadership at the highest order, some of which we said we're seeing demonstrated through Trump. But if world leaders embrace the higher consciousness and embrace that kind of leadership, how is that a solution for improving a relationship between countries and including not having conflicts like we saw in Russia and Ukraine? And it seems like the page is, we have an opportunity here that things could be turning in a direction. And we're seeing that in the elections in Europe, that they're changing. The people have had it over there too, and they're throwing the left out as well. What do you see as that impact of that on improving the world?
Okay, you are asking a very interesting question because with this whole turn to the right in the world, right? Is there any
Yeah.
space or room for high consciousness kind of like leaders? Technically speaking, it's the only opportunity now. Why? Because anything that's left leaning, it's the ideology that takes up all the breathing space in the room, right? So you drink
All the
my
oxygen.
Kool-Aid and think like me and act like me. That's the only way if you really want to get anything done. Now, never mind corruption, by the way, because this is just like, the prime directive, right? Lining pockets, using the ideological, narrative. Now, the whole swing to the right indicates that people are tired of this, okay? People are tired of this and they want to move forward. And that creates like a breathing space. And that's where the emerging higher consciousness leaders can step in because you combine two things: action oriented approach, okay, and demonstrating a new type of a leader who is a truly conscious leader, not in the sense of like the left converted the word conscious as being kind of nearly woke, right? Well, we're talking about a quality of a leader of being of a higher consciousness, okay? But that's a different story because this whole machinery of coaching and everything, they kept creating this more empathy, demonstrate EQ, blah blah blah, keep raising the bar. The trick with that was with the state of a psyche that our leaders had, they can't get there without a major upgrade.
Yes.
So you see, it's interesting. Over time, it just created the high bar of expectations and physical inability to meet that standard. Okay. So I think now with a new practical turn, that frees up a lot of leaders who were gaslighted, who were bullied and canceled. They can step forth to be emboldened and say, okay, I want to create a new world, but I need some new novel thinking away from all this nonsense. Okay. And I think this solution, I cannot think of too many people who can talk about this new vision, putting higher consciousness first, how it's done, what do you get as a result. So you're the only executive coach who early on you sensed that one day there would be a demand for the truly authentic leaders, not just like the ones who use a lot of blah, blah, blah.
I was way ahead of the curve, years ahead of the curve. It's painful. But I think the time has come. Finally, my senses were right on, and sometimes that's unfolding a vision. Well, we've navigated complex geopolitical dynamics, explored the power of influence and brainwashing, and unpacked the hidden layers of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. We looked at Trump's leadership and the evolving U.S.-Russia relationship and how business leaders can seize emerging opportunities. And ultimately, we reflected on how conscious leadership can drive positive transformation at a global scale. Now, why does this matter? Because understanding these forces isn't just about politics or economics. It's about creating a safer, more united, and more prosperous world for everyone. It's about helping leaders like you make informed, ethical decisions that shape the future. Because it's through high-quality leadership that we can create such a world. Now, to our listeners, if today's show brought you value, please consider subscribing to the podcast so you never miss an episode. And if you found the conversation enlightening, please share it with your colleagues, friends, or on social media. Because the more we broaden these conversations, the more we can collectively elevate leadership and consciousness. Further, if you're exploring opportunities in the Russian market and want expert guidance, Anatoly can help you develop a strategic approach to doing business in Russia. Feel free to reach out to me if that's of interest, and I'd be happy to arrange a free consultation with him to discuss how he can support your business success. Finally, as we close this show, remember as a leader, the most important tool you have is your ability to challenge your thinking, see more clearly, and expand your possibilities. That's how real transformation happens. Until next time, this is David Craig Utz, the Leadership Alchemist, signing off. Stay bold, stay curious, and keep leading with heart and vision.